Okay, so now that we know what shader doodle is, I'm personally excited to build an app from this. And like the last episode, we're gonna start from scratch. Blank page, nothing here. Take a look at this. We have nothing going on in Space Doodle yet, but to start, we're gonna have a little bit of a more complex front-end tooling setup on this project because we're gonna use TypeScript. And we're gonna use TypeScript because I wanna show some of the cooler features of Lit, like decorators. Decorators are a lot easier and nicer looking to work with in terms of like reactive properties, in terms of declaring custom elements, and a bunch of other stuff we're gonna run into along the way. But for now, just know we're gonna roll with TypeScript as we get started. So let's install a few dependencies to kick us off with. First, we have to, of course, create a package.json file. And right here, Space Doodle is the name of our project. I'm cool with that. We only have one runtime dependency right now, and that's gonna be Lit. We'll expand on that as we go along, but for now, Lit is all we need. But of course, we have some dev dependencies. This is our front-end tooling dependencies. So we have just a couple things right now for this, and we'll expand on this as we go along. But for right now, we have Web Dev Server and TypeScript. Web Dev Server, we used that in the last episode. It served us well. It was great. We're gonna use it again for this project, but we're gonna expand on some of this usage. And we're going to create a configuration file with Web Dev Server for some of the situations we encounter that, just don't quite work well with Web Dev Server as is out of the box. So it's good to know we can configure this stuff. But yeah, let's go. Let's npm install this stuff, npm install. And of course, we need some scripts. So first of all, we're going to have a TypeScript command. And of course, we could just do tsc, but again, I don't like to install things globally. I like to install them in my local node modules and refer to that to execute. So that's what I'm doing here. And of course, TypeScript watch, we're gonna create this task such that TypeScript will compile a thing, but then it'll just keep watching the files and compile it as these files change. And then of course, lastly, we want to serve this thing as well. And if you saw the first episode, we simply had WDS watch. This is Web Dev Server. It launches a server for us. It watches our files, so when we make those changes, it reloads, refreshes the page. This is great, but we need that extra step. We need to have TypeScript watch our files as well. So, and this ampersand right here, it lets us execute these two processes simultaneously. So TypeScript will watch, and then it will say, if there's changes, it will say, hey, I generated a new JavaScript file, which then Web Dev Server will kick in and say, all right, you changed that TypeScript file, you converted it to JavaScript, now we're gonna reload the page with the new JavaScript file you generated. This ampersand, it's kind of a Mac or Linux only thing. If you want to find out how to do this on Windows, I recommend going to modernweb.dev, looking over the guides, and looking over TypeScript and JSX. And you can see they recommend using something called concurrently for a cross-platform solution. But I'm going to be a bit lazy here because I'm not going to be testing on Windows, so if you want to find out how to do this on Windows, check out their suggestion to use concurrently. Now, the very last thing we need to do in our package.json here is have a type. And by default, it's common.js. We don't want that. We want to use modules. And this tells Node.js that we're using ES modules here. This doesn't really matter so much for our project, but our tooling behind the project. Since we're using modern tools here that are not common.js, and by saying type is module, we're telling Node.js that we're using modules here. And as we were adding our scripts here, you might have noticed that we passed in a TypeScript configuration file. So we're gonna make one of those. And these are not the settings I want. We're not gonna have common.js. Our target is gonna be ES 2020. Pretty new, but not new enough that we're gonna break things we need. So pretty stable there. Our module resolution is marked Node because we want to use the same thing kind of Web Dev Server uses, Node resolve, and we want TypeScript to do the same thing. We're gonna generate a source map because why not? Why not, really? Who doesn't love a good source map? Experimental decorators, we're gonna definitely turn this on. This is almost my entire reason for using TypeScript, because I want to use decorators in Lit. And we're going to include anything in our source folder that doesn't exist quite yet, but it will. We're going to include anything that has the TS extension for TypeScript. And we're going to exclude our node modules. I mean, just in case. The include should probably cover this, but I guess I'm just being careful here. So yeah, that's our TypeScript configuration file. So yeah, this is basically the extent of our front-end tooling setup. Now, these TypeScript settings, they are pretty relaxed. TypeScript won't bug us too much about doing every little thing we need to with a more strict setup. So this just gets our foot in the door for doing TypeScript stuff. And so now that our front-end tooling setup is done enough to get stuff on the page, let's create that page. So we're going to create a new HTML file. So now the contents of our HTML file, it's going to be really light. We're going to have a title. We're adding a script reference to doodle.js, which is going to live in our source folder once we have it. And then the style we're going to have on this page is basically the same thing we had in our last project. We're just making it a full size. We're going to make our content fill the entire page. No scrolling, background color of white. That's all that is. And then lastly, this will be our application web component, Doodle app. Because we're making a shader Doodle app, and why not call it Doodle app, right? So now let's just go and create our source folder. And so now I'm going to create a new file in our source folder called doodle.ts. This is TypeScript. And remember, we have our TypeScript configuration set up to say, hey, anything in your source folder, this is what we're including. This is what we're set up to transpile. We're going to look for anything in this folder with a TypeScript extension, and we're going to transpile it. And so with that open, let's just add some stuff. So yeah, if you followed along with us the first episode, this is the basic bare bones lit implementation. We're creating a class called Doodle. We're extending lit element. So this is going to be a web component. Right now, we're not returning any markup yet. It's just going to be a blank rendering. We do need to declare that this is a web component, though. So normally, if we were just using JavaScript, we could say custom element dot define, and then we'd give the tag a name and reference the class. We're not going to do that, though, because we're going to use decorators right out of the gate here. Now, to use these decorators, we're going to import one of the decorators we need, which is custom element. And what custom element does is we can drop this in, and we're declaring this to be a Doodle app custom element. So going back to our index.html, we set up the expectation here that we're going to call something Doodle app. This is going to be the component we're using. And right here is where we declare it. And again, in JavaScript, we can say custom elements dot define, and then pass in Doodle app as the tag name as a string, and the class name. But you know, I think it's a lot nicer just to do this because we can use this decorator. I am going to add an actual CSS file now, and I'm going to call it doodle.css. Now, if you saw the first episode, our style files were .css.js, so really they were JavaScript files. We put our CSS in those JavaScript files as a string, and wrapped it with some lit code, some lit friendly code, so we could import that elsewhere. So right here, this is going to be the exact same thing, except we're going to hide the lit wrapper, and we're gonna pretend, I guess, that this is an actual CSS file. We're gonna make web dev server do some extra work where it comes in, sees the CSS, and says, hey, I need to wrap you with some lit stuff so I can import this. It sounds like a hack, but we're really working up towards something that will really exist, which is importing actual CSS files as a feature in your browser. So I believe this already dropped in Chrome, and we're just waiting for the other browsers to add on this feature. But in the meantime, we can make web dev server do this extra work for us and pretend we're actually using a CSS file. So let's add some CSS here. And like I said, I just want a red background. So this is what I'm going to do. Red. 100% width and height, display of inline block. So now let's import that style, and then we can attach those styles to our element here. And we're mostly good, except there's one last thing. So TypeScript really doesn't know how to deal with this. Importing CSS isn't a feature yet, so TypeScript is complaining. So we need an extra file for TypeScript. And this is going to be a global definition file. So we're saying we're declaring a module anything called CSS, anything with a CSS extension, we're saying that you can expect a lit element CSS result from that. So now when we go back here, TypeScript is happy because it knows how to deal with an imported CSS file. But, you know, there's one last front-end tooling piece of the puzzle here, and that is a web dev server config file. Let's make one. Because we need web dev server to handle our CSS, but it's gonna be based on a plugin, which is not right out of the box in web dev server. So let's create a web dev server config file. Now, lit CSS is that plugin we will be using. So there's something called rollup plugin lit CSS, and you might not expect it to be rollup, right? So web dev server is, you know, the architecture underneath it all. The plugin architecture is based on rollup. We can use a bunch of plugins that were originally meant for rollup, but use them in web dev server. And it's a really nice thing because if, like, web dev server is a new technology, right? It's only been around so long, so, you know, plugins take a while to build up for an ecosystem like this, but guess what? Because it can consume rollup plugins, there's a whole lot of plugins we can use. Not all of them work because, you know, some of them are just, you know, final output, really not meant to be using in a live serving environment, but the ones that make sense to work in this environment usually do, I've found. So this is exactly what we need. We need the rollup plugin lit CSS. We do need to kind of wrap the rollup plugins with something from web dev server called server rollup. So how you deal with this is that you pass in whatever plugin you're working with, pass it in as a parameter to this from rollup function. And this is going to be the web dev server plugin we use, this wrapped function. And so we can just add plugin lit CSS as part of our web dev server config here. And the rest, node resolve, we covered that in the last episode. We're doing that again here. And the last thing we need here is MIME type. So we need to make sure that rollup can handle any incoming CSS file as JavaScript. So that should be pretty good, but I did forget to install the rollup plugin. So let's add that to our front-end tooling dependencies here. We'll go ahead and do one more npm install to get that installed. So let's do one initial compilation of TypeScript to get our files generated here. So run the TypeScript compilation process. And then, yes, look at this. We have Doodle.js right here. So now, hopefully, when we serve this, we can see that red background we wanted. npm run serve. And we do. Like I said, this is the only content we have in here now. It was a bit of a chore to get all this front-end tooling set up. It wasn't too bad though, but now that we have all this stuff set up, I think it's going to be fun to, you know, use decorators in this project. It's going to also be fun to, you know, pretend we're using actual CSS rather than CSS in JavaScript like we're actually doing. But yeah, I think this front-end tooling was a good first step. Now that that's all set up, let's pause here and continue in our next step.